Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The Harry Potter universe is famous not only for its charismatic heroes, but also for its vivid, unforgettable villains. Voldemort is a near-mythical figure, a symbol of ultimate evil, and yet he's not the only one remembered for his cunning schemes, but even the most terrifying villains make mistakes. Today, we'll break down the most questionable, illogical, and downright strange decisions they've made. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Voldemort, prioritizing theatrics over efficiency. You can say all you want about Voldemort's genius, but one of his glaring flaws is obvious. He was obsessed with spectacle. His love for dramatics often got in the way of achieving his goals. Take the ending of Goblet of Fire. Instead of killing Harry on the spot, he stages an entire theatrical performance, complete with a duel and monologue. Or Order of the Phoenix, when he could have ended Harry in seconds, or the Battle of Hogwarts, where he once again gives Harry a chance and drags out the moment, all this while his entire fate was hanging in the balance. Number 2, Bellatrix Lestrange, a romance with the Dark Lord. Bellatrix is the embodiment of fanatical loyalty. She committed atrocities in Voldemort's name, and apparently loved him not just as a leader. The cursed child makes this explicit. She had a child with him. But if you think about it, this is highly contradictory. Bellatrix was married, a blood purity extremist, and Voldemort was a half-blood. Where's the logic? Seems even the most deranged fanatics can lose their heads, literally. Number 3, Peter Pettigrew, hiding with the Weasleys. After faking his death, Peter could have vanished forever, but instead he hides with the Weasleys, one of the most respected and active families in the Order of the Phoenix. This move was practically an invitation to be exposed. He knew about the Marauders' map. It could be reactivated at any time. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were constantly around. It was only a matter of time. For a coward, this was a strange mix of recklessness and desperation. Number 4. Lucius Malfoy, giving Ginny Weasley the diary. Lucius Malfoy is usually careful and calculating, but in Chamber of Secrets he does the opposite. He hands an artifact containing a piece of Voldemort's soul to a little girl, Arthur Weasley's daughter. Sure, he had reasons to strike at Dumbledore and the Ministry, but the risks, losing the diary, botching the plan, getting exposed, and all of that for petty school-level revenge. Not exactly the smartest move from the pragmatic Lucius. Number 5. Gilderoy Lockhart, confessing to Harry and Ron. Yes, Lockhart isn't a villain in the traditional sense, but in Chamber of Secrets he is most certainly an antagonist. His habit of stealing credit, erasing memories, and lying for fame is pure evil in a comedic disguise. And then he confesses everything. To 2 students. Why? For a dramatic punchline? To gloat before wiping their memories? It's idiotic. So idiotic, in fact, that even his own wand rebelled against him. Number 6. Quirrell, attempting to kill Harry during the match. Quirrell is Harry Potter's first real villain. He has brains, a plan, and Voldemort's backing. But when he decides to kill Harry, he does it during a Quidditch match in front of the entire school. The plan, naturally, fails. And what's more shocking, no one even suspects Quirrell despite how obvious it was. Still, for a dark wizard, this method was absurdly clumsy and way too public. Number 7. Dolores Umbridge, firing Trelawney. Umbridge represents institutional evil. She follows the rules on the surface, but leaves disgust in her wake. One of her most baffling decisions, trying to fire Sybil Trelawney. It wasn't just pointless, it was strategically stupid. She openly challenged Dumbledore's authority and turned the staff and students against her. In the end, Trelawney stayed, and Umbridge lost everything. Ironically, Trelawney's fate turned out far better. Number 8. Draco Malfoy, hesitating on the astronomy tower. Draco Malfoy held the wand, but his hand shook. On the astronomy tower, Dumbledore stood disarmed, weakened, alone. No backup, no tricks, just a dying man waiting for the killing curse. Draco, he said gently, You are not a killer. And that was the moment. Voldemort had chosen Draco to send a message. Fail, and your family suffers. Succeed, and you're marked forever. But Draco couldn't do it. His pride collapsed. His mask cracked. For months, he plotted in secret, fixing the vanishing cabinet, isolating himself, letting the pressure build. He watched Katie Bell nearly die. He saw Ron poisoned. He knew what was at stake. But when the time came, all that cruelty vanished. "I have to do this," Draco whispered. Yet he lowered his wand. He stalled. He cried. Dumbledore, barely standing, offered him a choice. Not power, not escape, but redemption. And Draco, torn between fear and guilt, chose nothing. From a villain's perspective, it was failure. The mission was clear. Kill Dumbledore. Prove your worth. Instead, Draco hesitated and let Snape finish what he couldn't. In Half-Blood Prince, that pause changed the war. Voldemort wanted a weapon. He got a boy. Draco didn't become a hero, but he refused to become a murderer. And in that single act of defiance, quiet and trembling, he showed more strength than most dark wizards ever do. Number 9, Barty Crouch Jr., overexposing himself while disguised. Barty Crouch Jr. pulled off the impossible. For an entire year he fooled everyone at Hogwarts, including Dumbledore, by impersonating Alastor Moody. Polyjuice potion, a stolen flask, and a locked trunk with the real Moody hidden inside. The disguise was perfect, but his performance, that was too much. Instead of blending in, Crouch gave flashy, intense lessons that no one could forget. In Goblet of Fire, he cast all 3 unforgivable curses in front of fourth-year students. When Neville Longbottom trembled at the Cruciatus curse, Crouch watched him with unnatural interest. That wasn't Moody's style, and the staff noticed. He didn't stop there. He took Harry under his wing. He pushed him toward the Triwizard Tournament. He handed him Gillyweed. Every move was precise, too precise. Dobby noticed. Snape became suspicious. McGonagall frowned more than usual. Crouch didn't just teach defense against the dark arts, he turned it into theatre. And that theatre drew eyes. When Dumbledore finally broke into his office, the truth unravelled fast. The real Moody was discovered. The Polyjuice potion ran out. And Barty, trembling and cornered, confessed everything. If Crouch had kept his head down, he might have succeeded. The plan was solid. Get Harry to the graveyard, deliver him to Voldemort. But Barty didn't want to just win, he wanted to show off. His brilliance, his loyalty, his darkness. And in doing so, he forgot the first rule of a disguise. Don't be memorable. Number 10, Gellert Grindelwald, trusting Credence. Grindelwald played a long game. He moved pieces in silence, whispered promises, planted fear. But with Credence barebone, he gambled everything. He didn't just use the boy, he gave him a name, Aurelius Dumbledore, a lie crafted like a weapon, and Grindelwald, who trusted no one, handed it to the most unstable soul he could find. Credence was powerful, yes, an obscurial with rage boiling beneath his skin. But he was also broken, abandoned, hungry for belonging. Grindelwald saw that weakness and mistook it for loyalty. In the Crimes of Grindelwald, he leads Credence into battle. He lets him attack, destroy, kill. And all the while, Credence believes he's fighting for truth, for family. "You are the only entity alive who can kill him," Grindelwald whispers, meaning Dumbledore. But Credence doesn't understand the war. He barely understands himself. Grindelwald makes him the center of everything. He tells his army to protect him. He builds a prophecy around him, but the boy is shaking, lost. He lashes out at allies. He loses control. And when the moment comes, when Grindelwald needs him calm, focused, Credence collapses. The fire he was meant to control devours everything. Credence doesn't kill Dumbledore. He doesn't even get close. Grindelwald placed his future in the hands of someone still searching for who he was. For a man so cold and calculating, Grindelwald made the most emotional decision of all. He mistook pain for purpose. He saw in Credence a reflection of himself, wounded, powerful, angry. But Credence wasn't a weapon. He was a boy torn apart by lies, and Grindelwald's trust, meant to forge victory, only ensured failure. He lost control the moment he said, "You are my brother," because he believed the lie too. Number 11, Voldemort, ignoring the power of House Elves. Voldemort never saw Dobby coming. He never looked down far enough. In his world, power came from bloodlines, dark magic, and domination. Creatures like house elves were tools, silent, invisible, disposable. But Dobby wasn't just a servant. He was free. And when Harry Potter was trapped in the Malfoy Manor, bleeding and broken, it wasn't Dumbledore or the Order who saved him. It was Dobby. The escape was impossible. Draco had taken their wands. Bellatrix was screaming. Hermione had just been tortured. And then came the snap of fingers. The chandelier fell, the dagger flew, and before anyone could blink, they were gone. Dobby apparated through anti-apparition spells, something Voldemort's own followers couldn't do. "Such a beautiful place," Dobby whispered, as he died in Harry's arms. The elf gave his life to save them. Voldemort never even learned his name. That moment rewrote the war. Because Harry survived, he could break into Gringotts. He could destroy the Horcrux in the cup. He could face Voldemort in the forest. And all of it, every step, began with Dobby's bravery. Voldemort never understood that true loyalty can't be bought with fear. It must be earned with kindness. And Dobby, who had once ironed his own hands for disobedience, defied the darkest wizard alive out of love. If Voldemort had studied house elves, he would have known they don't follow the same magical rules. They can bypass protections. They can wield unique power. But he dismissed them, just as he dismissed love, sacrifice, and mercy. He built his empire on cruelty and forgot that small hands can pull down great towers. Dobby never carried a wand. He didn't need one. He had courage. And that, in the end, was magic Voldemort couldn't understand. Number 12, Death Eaters, underestimating the order of the Phoenix. The Death Eaters believed fear was enough. They thought robes and skull masks made them invincible. When Lucius Malfoy led them into the Department of Mysteries, he expected a quick, silent victory. Just scare the kids, grab the prophecy, and vanish. But what they found was not fear. They found 6 students who had already faced death and wouldn't run from it. Harry, Hermione, Ron, Neville, Ginny, and Luna stood their ground. And the Death Eaters hesitated. They mocked the young fighters. Bellatrix Lestrange laughed as she taunted Neville. Dolohov nearly killed Hermione, but they didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect teamwork. When Luna used the Reductor Curse to blast shelves apart, it forced them into retreat. When Ron tackled a Death Eater through the time room, it was chaos. And when Harry held the prophecy in his hands, Lucius realized too late that he had lost control. "Now get it to me, Potter," he ordered. But Harry wasn't listening anymore. Then came the worst surprise of all, the Order. Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Mad-Eye Moody. They arrived in a blaze of spells. It was no longer a game. The Death Eaters panicked. Even Bellatrix, fierce, wild Bellatrix, fled the battlefield when Voldemort failed to protect her. And Lucius, captured. His failure cost him everything: dignity, freedom, the Dark Lord's favor. The Death Eaters never respected the Order. They saw it as weak, sentimental, bound by morality. But they forgot one thing. Those who fight to protect have something worth dying for. The Order didn't wear masks. They didn't hide behind cruelty. And that night in the Ministry, they reminded the Death Eaters that courage, not fear, decides who wins a war. Number 13. Voldemort, Distrusting Snape. Lord Voldemort trusted few, and Severus Snape was never truly one of them. Despite Snape's years of loyal service, his mastery of occlumency, and his unique access to Albus Dumbledore, Voldemort kept him at arm's length. Even after Snape delivered him critical information about the Order, Voldemort withheld the full truth of his plans. "You are a good and faithful servant, Severus," he said, in the Half-Blood Prince, but the words always came laced with doubt. In the shadows of every compliment, there was suspicion. Voldemort's paranoia was his weakness. He questioned Snape's motives, tested his loyalty, and excluded him from key strategies, like the plan to steal the prophecy or the exact timing of the attack on Harry in the forest. Snape, for all his deception, would have failed instantly if Voldemort had simply trusted him more. But the Dark Lord never did. He believed himself smarter than everyone else. He believed fear alone could bind loyalty. He never saw that Snape's real allegiance was shaped not by threats, but by love. Love for Lily Potter. The irony is brutal. In Deathly Hallows, Voldemort murders Snape under the false belief that it will grant him mastery over the Elder Wand. It's the final act of distrust. He doesn't even question Snape's version of events. He doesn't look deeper. The wand does not truly belong to me, he says. Snape killed Dumbledore. So he kills Snape, and in that moment he destroys the only person who had fooled him from the very beginning. If Voldemort had let go of his pride, Snape's secrets would have come to light. The double agent could have been unmasked before Harry ever stepped into the forest. But the Dark Lord's arrogance and obsession with control blinded him. His distrust gave Snape freedom, and it was that freedom that allowed the boy with his mother's eyes to walk into the forest and survive. Number 14, Cornelius Fudge, denying Voldemort's return. When Harry Potter returned from the graveyard in Goblet of Fire and told the world that Lord Voldemort had risen, Cornelius Fudge looked into the boy's eyes and chose to lie. He had just seen the body of Cedric Diggory, the mark on Harry's arm, and the terror in Dumbledore's face. But instead of acting, the Minister of Magic shook his head and said coldly, "He's not back. He's not." That moment changed everything. It wasn't Voldemort who gave the Dark Lord time to rise again. It was Fudge. Fudge feared the truth more than he feared evil. He imagined headlines, ministry instability, and public panic. So he made a decision: deny, discredit Harry, undermine Dumbledore, pretend nothing had happened. And while he spun his version of events, Voldemort gathered allies. Bellatrix Lestrange escaped Azkaban. Lucius Malfoy returned to the Dark Circle. In Order of the Phoenix, Arthur Weasley is nearly killed in the Department of Mysteries. And still, Fudge calls it nonsense. He even places Umbridge in Hogwarts to suppress talk of Voldemort's return. He didn't just lie to the public. He weaponized the system to silence the truth. This blindness cost lives. Sirius Black fell through the veil. The battle at the Ministry never should have happened. Fudge had a year to act, to prepare his world for war. Instead, he spent it attacking children in newspapers. "You have been told that a certain dark wizard has returned from the dead," he barks at the Wizengamot. "This is a lie." But the lie didn't protect them. It left them open. The magical world was not ready when the shadows finally crept back in. When Dumbledore says, "You must choose between what is right and what is easy," he is not talking to Voldemort. He is talking to men like Cornelius Fudge, powerful men who feared truth more than tyranny. In his refusal to face reality, Fudge did what no Death Eater could. He gave Voldemort exactly what he needed: time, secrecy, and division. In a story about courage, his cowardice is unforgettable. Number 15, Voldemort accidentally making Harry a Horcrux. Lord Voldemort, once Tom Marvolo Riddle, was a man who feared nothing more than death. In his desperate obsession to conquer mortality, he fragmented his soul into pieces and hid them within Horcruxes, vessels meant to anchor his life to the mortal realm. Each Horcrux was meticulously chosen, significant, symbolic, and powerful. The diary of his school days, the ring of his ancestry, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, the locket of Salazar Slytherin, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, and even the snake Nagini all held deep meaning and served as strategic reservoirs of immortality. But amid these deliberate choices stood one inexplicable, illogical, and ultimately fatal error: Harry James Potter. The boy who lived was never meant to become a Horcrux. And yet, Voldemort's own magic, twisted by arrogance, hate, and a lack of understanding, implanted a shard of his soul into a child he had just tried to kill. On that fateful Halloween night in Godric's Hollow, Voldemort arrived with murderous certainty. Armed with the prophecy and convinced that killing the infant Harry would eliminate the only threat to his future reign, he cast the killing curse. But the spell backfired. Lily Potter's sacrifice forged a powerful protective charm that rebounded Voldemort's own curse, destroying his body and reducing him to a shadow of life. In that violent rupture, a fragment of his soul, unmoored and desperate, latched onto the only living thing in the room, the child he had marked for death. Neither can live while the other survives. Sybil. Trelawney's prophecy foretold, and in attempting to prevent that future, Voldemort ensured it. What made this decision so baffling was not only its accidental nature, but how inconsistent it was with Voldemort's entire philosophy. The man who prided himself on control and precision created a Horcrux he could not monitor, influence, or even recognize. Horace Slughorn, in his memory of the fateful conversation with young Tom Riddle, had warned that splitting the soul was an act of supreme evil. To do it unintentionally, without ritual, without deliberate focus, was something even Voldemort, in all his confidence, had not anticipated. "He didn't mean to make you a Horcrux, Harry," Dumbledore later explained. "It happened in the moment he tried to kill you." In making Harry a Horcrux, Voldemort forged a connection that would prove both intimate and destructive. Harry could feel Voldemort's thoughts, his emotions, his location. Pain in Harry's scar was not just a physical sensation, but a psychic tether, one that echoed with the Dark Lord's fury. "Something you'll never know, Tom," Dumbledore once told Voldemort, "is that there are worse things than death." And the irony was cruel. Voldemort, in fleeing death, had unintentionally given his enemy the means to find him. The boy grew up with dreams that were not his own. Visions of the Department of Mysteries, flashes of Voldemort's rage, a deep, unshakable sense of what the Dark Lord was doing without being able to stop it. The damage did not stop there. By lodging his soul inside a child, Voldemort made Harry the only being on Earth who could survive his return. The protective charm that Lily cast, the sacrificial love that shielded Harry, combined with the soul fragment to make Harry immune to Voldemort's power for years. This was evident in the graveyard duel of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Voldemort, reborn and confident, found his spells unexpectedly countered. The twin cores of their wands, both containing feathers from the same phoenix, forks, locked together in a priori incantatem. The connection between them was not merely magical, it was anchored in the soul. Harry's presence disrupted Voldemort's power not just because of wand lore, but because part of Voldemort lived within him. In the Department of Mysteries, Harry's link to Voldemort became a liability. The vision of Sirius Black tortured and trapped lured him into a trap, one that resulted in the death of his godfather. But even then the psychic bond proved both a curse and a weapon. When Voldemort tried to possess Harry, it was Harry's love, grief, and humanity that drove him out. "You're the weak one," Harry whispered in Order of the Phoenix, "and you'll never know love or friendship. And I feel sorry for you." Voldemort could not abide the emotions that Harry radiated. The fragment within him, a piece of a soul twisted by hatred, was not meant to share space with kindness. But perhaps the greatest consequence of Voldemort's mistake was how it limited his own path forward. Every Horcrux he made was meant to ensure his invincibility, but the one inside Harry made him vulnerable. As long as Harry lived, so did a piece of Voldemort. and the only way to destroy the Dark Lord completely was to destroy that piece. When Dumbledore realized the truth, he made a grim conclusion. Harry had to die. Voldemort himself created his worst enemy, Dumbledore said in Deathly Hallows. And it was his own careless cruelty, his own foolish mistake. It was a prophecy fulfilled by self-fulfilling arrogance. In trying to prevent his destruction, Voldemort had made it inevitable. What made the situation more tragic was how Voldemort's fear blinded him to the consequences. He never understood love, sacrifice, or loyalty. He dismissed them as weaknesses irrelevant to power, but these were the very forces that sustained Harry, friends who stood by him, mentors who guided him, a mother's love that endured death. Voldemort, by contrast, trusted no one, valued no life but his own, and saw others as pawns. He failed to see that Harry, despite being a child, would grow into a force stronger than any spell because he had something Voldemort never could possess. A soul unbroken. Number 16, Nagini, participating directly in battles. Nagini slithered through the pages of the Harry Potter saga like a shadow of death itself. Elegant, venomous, ever-watching. More than just a serpent, she was a companion, a weapon, and, most crucially, the last remaining Horcrux in Lord Voldemort's quest for immortality. Her very existence embodied everything he feared: mortality, weakness, and the possibility of defeat. And yet, when the final war came crashing down upon the stones of Hogwarts, Nagini was not hidden away in a vault or a dark chamber. Instead, she was unleashed into the heart of the battlefield, exposed to risk, violence, and ultimately death. For a man obsessed with controlling every aspect of his survival, Voldemort's decision to allow Nagini to openly fight was not only reckless, it was fatally ironic. By the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort had already lost every other Horcrux. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, all destroyed. He no longer suspected the link between himself and Harry Potter, which made Nagini his final lifeline, the last vessel anchoring his soul to the world. Yet she was not kept under layers of protection, nor was she encased in enchantments or guarded by legions of Death Eaters. She was placed at the side of Severus Snape, an already compromised figure in the eyes of the Dark Lord, and sent forth into chaos. The decision lacks any strategic foresight, and worse, it reveals the cracks in Voldemort's supposed genius. One must consider the psychological landscape of Voldemort at this time. This is a man who has spent his entire adult life building layers of defense around his mortality. He created Horcruxes precisely so that no one act of violence could ever bring him down. But with Nagini, the final Horcrux, he behaved not like a calculating immortal, but like a general blinded by pride. "You must be the one to kill me, Severus," Voldemort says in the Deathly Hallows, driven by his flawed understanding of the Elder Wand's allegiance. It is during this miscalculated act of murder that Nagini is commanded to strike, slamming herself against Snape in a cage of magical glass, tearing his throat with venomous ferocity. It is here that Voldemort reveals his willingness to weaponize the very creature holding his last fragment of soul. The irony is breathtaking. Nagini, the vault of immortality, is transformed into a blunt instrument of execution. For a few fleeting moments of dominance, Voldemort stakes everything. He could have used any Death Eater, he could have used the wand itself, but instead he lets Nagini serve as both executioner and exposed target. The fragility of this choice becomes undeniable when viewed in hindsight. As chaos erupted around the castle, Voldemort wandered its ruins, assuming his soul was safe because it was near him. But near is not protected. Safe is not invincible. Neville Longbottom was not meant to be the hero. In Voldemort's story, Neville was a minor player, an afterthought. Yet it is Neville who steps into the role of executioner, who draws the sword of Gryffindor, and with one decisive blow severs not just a serpent's head, but Voldemort's final tether to life. "The snake's dead, he's gone!" the students cry, echoing through the shattered halls like a prophecy fulfilled. Nagini's death is not just a physical loss, it's the unraveling of the one safeguard Voldemort had left. In one motion, everything he built turns to ash. It is worth remembering that Nagini was not simply an object to Voldemort. Her role in the story carries deep emotional weight. She was often draped around him like a sinister crown. She delivered messages, guarded his victims, and even feasted on the corpses he left behind. There is a macabre intimacy in their bond, something no other Horcrux ever achieved. Yet Voldemort's attachment blinded him. He stopped seeing her as a vessel of his soul and began treating her as a living extension of his power. That delusion cost him everything. Had Voldemort truly been the master of death, he would have hidden Nagini deep underground. He would have cloaked her in the most ancient enchantments, sealed her beneath a fortress, and let her rest unseen until the war's end. Instead, he paraded her through the final act like a banner of terror, allowing even the least trained wizard to glimpse his vulnerability. He forgot the most basic lesson of war: protect what you cannot replace. The story of Nagini's demise is not merely a tactical blunder, it is a thematic climax. Every Horcrux carried within it a sliver of Voldemort's pride, his arrogance, his inability to conceive of defeat. But Nagini carried more than that. She carried trust. And that trust became his undoing. Voldemort trusted that no one would be bold enough, strong enough, or foolish enough to strike at the serpent. He was wrong. He underestimated the bravery of Neville, the desperation of the defenders, and the chaotic beauty of hope. The scene of her death is almost mythic. Amid shattered stones and burning skies, Neville emerges from the crowd, unswayed by Voldemort's cruelty or his own wounds. The sword of Gryffindor gleams in his hands, summoned not by magic alone, but by courage. Then there was a loud bang and a cascade of golden sparks, Rowling writes. Neville Longbottom had drawn the sword from the sorting hat. What follows is both grotesque and glorious, the head of the serpent spinning through the air, landing with finality. The last Horcrux is gone. Voldemort, unaware, is already dead in all but name. That Voldemort did not see this coming is a reflection of his blindness, not his genius. In his arrogance, he believed that fear would paralyze his enemies, that no one would dare to strike the serpent beside him. But he never understood love, sacrifice, or courage, not truly. He thought power was armor, but in truth it was his chain. He had chained himself to Nagini, believing it made him stronger. Instead, it made him vulnerable in the most poetic way. Number 17, Dolores Umbridge, using the Horcrux in interrogations. Dolores Umbridge had always been a figure shrouded in pastel-coloured menace. Her delicate bows and kitten plaits belied the severity of her methods, and beneath her sugar-coated smile hid an ambition as ruthless as any Death Eater's. Appointed by the Ministry of Magic to oversee Hogwarts during one of its darkest years, she became the embodiment of corrupted authority. But even for someone as blind to reason and empathy as Umbridge, her decision to use Salazar Slytherin's locket, a Horcrux, as a tool during interrogations was more than questionable. It was catastrophic. Whether she understood the nature of the artifact or not, the consequences of her actions rippled far beyond her intent to instill fear. The locket had already been known to corrupt the hearts of those who wore it. When Ron Weasley carried it during the trio's search for Horcruxes, it turned his own insecurities against him. "He's your best friend," the locket whispered into his mind, "but he'd rather be with her." The artifact fed off the wearer's deepest fears and resentments. In Ron's case, it nearly tore apart the friendship that had endured 6 years of trials. And this was just from proximity, just from wearing it. Umbridge, however, took it one step further. She didn't merely wear the locket as a symbol of status. She used it in closed rooms, in ministry chambers, where frightened Muggle-borns were brought for questioning. Her choice transformed that space from an office of law into a chamber of psychological warfare. It is important to remember that Horcruxes are fragments of a soul, shattered and sealed through murder. This particular piece belonged to Voldemort, the darkest wizard of the age. Every Horcrux carried a shade of his malice, and the locket was no exception. That Umbridge used such an artifact without understanding its dark nature is terrifying in its own right. Yet what makes it worse is the possibility that she did understand, at least partially, and still chose to wield it. Whether out of willful ignorance or the quiet thrill of power, Dolores allowed herself to be a vessel for Voldemort's evil, believing she controlled it when in reality it had begun to control her. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was a farce of justice, orchestrated by Umbridge with a disturbing sense of order. Witnesses sat alone, surrounded by stone walls and enchanted chains, and were made to prove their magical worth. Often they had no means to do so. Magic, by nature, flows through blood, but it is not determined by it, and as they sat in that courtroom, with Umbridge perched above them in her desk like a pink vulture, the locket around her neck pulsed with an energy they couldn't name but instinctively feared. Its influence wasn't visible like a curse, but its effect was no less potent. Fear grew sharper, shame cut deeper. Words faltered. Mary Cattermole was one of these victims. Her quiet defiance, standing in front of Umbridge insisting she had never stolen magic, was a moment of courage. But the trial was never fair. "You are lying," Umbridge said coldly, her voice flat and cruel. The locket glinted against her throat. The Dementors flanking her seat hovered close. Mary's hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. A heaviness in the air, a dread that sapped her will. She was not alone in this sensation. Those who entered the chamber would speak later, if they survived, of a strange darkness in the room, a twisting of thought, a weight on the chest. They would not know it, but they were being touched by a piece of Voldemort's soul. The decision to wear the locket was not born of fashion or sentiment. Umbridge claimed she had found it as part of a ministry inventory, an unclaimed heirloom of a pure-blood family. She likely believed its origins noble, its crest a mark of honor. Salazar Slytherin's snake was enough to enchant her, obsessed as she was with bloodlines. But it is hard to ignore the symbolism. She wore a piece of dark magic made by a man who saw half the magical world as unworthy. She placed it against her heart and walked into courtrooms as judge and jury over those she deemed impure. In doing so, she carried with her not just Voldemort's ideology, but his literal essence. The question remains, how could someone so embedded in the ministry, so obsessed with rules and order, fall so easily into the hands of evil? Perhaps the answer lies in her nature. Dolores Umbridge did not see herself as cruel. She believed in discipline, in structure, in preserving traditions. But when those traditions were used to separate, to punish, and to dehumanize, they became tools of tyranny. The locket didn't plant those ideas in her, it merely amplified what was already there. Like a magnifying glass over dry grass, it sparked a fire from her existing prejudices. In this way, the locket found a perfect host. Unlike Ron, who resisted its poison out of loyalty and love, Umbridge welcomed its effects. It emboldened her. She became sharper in her interrogations, more decisive in her accusations. Her eyes grew colder. She slept less. Her voice, once artificially sweet, became brittle. The locket fed off her cruelty as much as it encouraged it. And all the while, she never suspected that she was being used. In her arrogance, she believed she was in control. That arrogance led to her downfall. When Harry, Hermione, and Ron infiltrated the Ministry under Polyjuice Potion, they found Umbridge as gleeful as ever. But her attachment to the locket became her weakness. She wore it as a badge of power, unaware that it marked her as a target. Hermione recognized it immediately. Harry felt its pull. They knew what it was. In that moment, Umbridge became not just a tyrant, but a keeper of dark relics. The confrontation that followed was swift. Stunning spells flew, the trio escaped, and the locket was torn from her neck. Number 18, Death Eaters, attacking Bill and Fleur's wedding. The summer sun had barely dipped beneath the horizon when the Death Eaters descended upon the burrow. For the magical community, the wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour was not only a celebration of love, it was a flickering torch of defiance in darkening times. The Ministry had fallen. Lord Voldemort had seized control. Yet here, in the countryside, members of the Order of the Phoenix dared to celebrate, dared to gather in public. For the Death Eaters, this must have seemed like the perfect opportunity to strike, to deliver a devastating blow to the opposition. But what followed was not a masterstroke of terror. It was a clumsy, unfocused mess, an attack that revealed more about the cracks within Voldemort's forces than the power of his grip. With the Ministry under his thumb and the wizarding press parroting propaganda, Voldemort had nearly total control, but power must be wielded wisely. The attack on the wedding wasn't just aggressive, it was reckless. No attempt was made to isolate key targets or secure the perimeter. There was no containment strategy, no plan to capture or kill high-ranking members of the Order. It was a theatrical ambush designed to cause chaos. And chaos, as it turns out, favors those who are prepared to vanish. The Ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming, Kingsley's Patronus had warned in the book. A silver lynx slicing through the air moments before the storm broke. It was a clear sign the attackers had lost the element of surprise even before they began. In military or strategic terms, surprise is not just a tool, it is the weapon. When you spring an ambush, it must be swift and irreversible. But Voldemort's followers were not trained soldiers. They were bullies with wands. Their confidence stemmed from fear, not skill. And so when they burst into the wedding tent, they found not cowed victims, but battle-hardened veterans. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Arthur Weasley, Remus Lupin, and other members of the Order were scattered among the guests. They reacted instantly, not with panic, but with practiced resistance. Instead of capturing enemies, the Death Eaters were met with shields, hexes, and instant disapparition. More damning than the chaos was the complete failure to achieve the mission's implied goal, to trap Harry Potter. Voldemort's obsession with the boy had blinded him time and again, but this was particularly wasteful. The wedding had been one of the few predictable moments when Harry might appear in public, and yet instead of laying a trap or waiting for a clear shot, the Death Eaters simply charged in. Within seconds, Harry, Ron, and Hermione vanished into the London night, beginning the year-long mission that would ultimately destroy Voldemort's last Horcruxes. If the attack on the wedding had succeeded, the war could have ended before it truly began. Instead, it accelerated the collapse of the Death Eaters' own grip. One must wonder what Voldemort hoped to gain. If it was fear, he succeeded only partially. The attack certainly sent shockwaves through the magical community. But fear that does not lead to paralysis is a weak weapon. In the days that followed, the attack was not remembered as a show of force, but as a warning that the regime could not control even a rural celebration. For those already skeptical of the Ministry's new leadership, this event proved their worst fears. It rallied the disillusioned. "It was them, wasn't it?" Arthur Weasley said afterward. "Death Eaters, we've got to disappear before they come back." The regime's enemies became ghosts, slipping through shadows instead of gathering in plain sight. In storytelling terms, every villain needs credibility. The power to instill dread must be earned through precision and consistency. But the wedding attack damaged Voldemort's image more than it reinforced it. He had just overthrown the Ministry, a symbol of overwhelming dominance. But attacking a wedding? It seemed petty. Brutal, yes, but small. Instead of looking like a god, He looked like a man chasing ghosts, willing to destroy innocent celebrations on the chance of catching a glimpse of his prey. The wizarding public, increasingly forced to hide, began to compare whispered notes, and in those whispers, the myth began to erode. Far more effective would have been a coordinated strike on the Order's infrastructure. At that point in the war, Voldemort still lacked critical information. Where were the Order's safe houses? What artifacts might Dumbledore have left behind? What did Harry Potter know that Voldemort didn't? None of these questions could be answered by attacking a wedding. And worse, the attack scattered key targets. After the wedding, the trio began their Horcrux hunt in earnest, travelling under magical protections and leaving no trace. A more measured, intelligent assault, perhaps even covert surveillance of the event, might have produced real results, but Voldemort was never one for patience. In truth, this was not the first time Voldemort had allowed emotion to override logic. In the Department of Mysteries, his decision to lure Harry with a false vision nearly cost him Lucius Malfoy and a chunk of his inner circle. At the Ministry takeover, he left the task of interrogating Scrimgeour to others instead of appearing in person. Now, at the wedding, he repeated the same mistake, sending Death Eaters instead of striking with strategic purpose. He trusted his followers to act with the same precision he imagined himself to have, forgetting that brutality is not the same as competence. Perhaps the greatest tragedy for Voldemort was that this attack gave Harry and his friends the perfect excuse to disappear without suspicion. Prior to this, they had planned to slip away quietly. Now they had cover. The attack was so loud, so shocking, that no one questioned why they vanished. It provided them with narrative protection, both in the eyes of the Death Eaters and the magical public. The trio became martyrs and rebels overnight, slipping beneath the radar just as Voldemort was most desperate to find them. "They've gone underground, haven't they?" one Death Eater grumbled in later chapters. And underground they remained, gathering secrets and destroying the very anchors of Voldemort's immortality. There is also something deeply symbolic in attacking a wedding. Weddings are about unity, about future, about hope. In striking such an occasion, Voldemort branded himself not just as a tyrant but as an enemy of life itself. That symbolism did not go unnoticed. The magical community may have been cowed by Ministry control, but they still remembered who danced at that wedding, who celebrated despite the shadows. As word spread of the attack, sympathy for the victims deepened. What was meant to be a blow to morale became a rallying cry. It is important to remember the caliber of those present. Kingsley Shacklebolt, a masterful duelist and strategist. Remus Lupin, a seasoned fighter. Arthur and Molly Weasley, veterans of the First Wizarding War. And even the twins, Fred and George, were more dangerous than they appeared, their joke shop now a front for resistance magic. These were not ordinary guests. This was the core of the opposition, all together. And yet, not one was captured. That, more than anything, signaled the weakness of Voldemort's approach. He had one chance to decapitate the rebellion. Instead, he scattered it like embers, and some embers set fire to empires. The Death Eaters themselves did not gain glory that day. None of them achieved any significant objective. They came like shadows and vanished like cowards. Unlike the Battle of the Astronomy Tower or the ambush at the Lovegood House, there was no clear victory to claim, no symbol to exploit. The wedding attack was bloodless, purposeless, and ultimately forgettable in terms of military success. Its only legacy was strategic failure, a reminder that evil, when it acts without discipline, often undermines itself. As the war escalated, this mistake only loomed larger. Every Horcrux destroyed, every secret uncovered, could be traced back to the freedom granted in that single moment. If Harry had been captured, the Elder Wand may never have changed hands. If Ron had been killed, the locket may never have been destroyed. If Hermione had fallen, the secrets of Godric's Hollow might never have been unlocked. The fate of the world shifted at that wedding, not because of Voldemort's power, but because of his failure to wield it with precision. What made this failure all the more tragic for Voldemort was the simplicity of what could have been. A single undercover agent, a timed assault with portkey blocks, a handful of Dementors to break morale before the battle. None of this would have required vast resources, just planning, just patience. But Voldemort had neither. He wanted fireworks, he got shadows, and the resistance, instead of burning, learned to hide in plain sight. It is tempting to view Voldemort as an unstoppable force, but every tyrant falls by his own hand. The wedding of Bill and Fleur should have been a slaughter. Instead, it became the beginning of the end, not because of the strength of the Order, but because of the weakness of the one who sought to destroy it. Number 19. Voldemort killing Snape. Without understanding the Elder Wand. Voldemort's decision to kill Severus Snape near the boathouse stands as one of the most perplexing and self-destructive moments in the entire Harry Potter saga. Convinced that mastery of the Elder Wand would be his only path to victory, he chose to murder Snape in cold blood. What he did not realize, however, was that this act did not bring him any closer to unlocking the wand's true power. It exposed not only his lack of understanding of wand lore, but also his fundamental failure to grasp the deep, ancient rules of magical allegiance. In this single moment, Voldemort sealed his fate, not through weakness, but through ignorance. The Elder Wand, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, had a dark and complex history. Its loyalty was never determined by murder alone. The wand did not require its master to be killed. It required the master to be defeated. Voldemort, driven by the illusion of invincibility and twisted logic, assumed that because Snape had killed Dumbledore, Snape had earned the wand's loyalty. He believed that by killing Snape he would become its true master. Yet this conclusion was based on false assumptions and a profound misinterpretation of events. The irony lies in Voldemort's perception of himself as the most knowledgeable and powerful wizard of his age. His obsession with the Elder Wand consumed him, but he never bothered to understand its true nature. He saw it as an object to be controlled, subdued, dominated, much like how he viewed every living being around him. He failed to understand that power, particularly magical power, often flows through more subtle channels than brute force. The wand recognized something that Voldemort never could. Mastery is not always won by death. When Voldemort ordered Nagini to strike Snape, he did so without a flicker of doubt. To him, it was a necessary step in a grand logical sequence: eliminate the current master and inherit the power. But Snape, despite all that had been hidden about his motives, was never the true master of the Elder Wand. The wand's loyalty had never belonged to him. Dumbledore, understanding the importance of wand allegiance, had orchestrated his own death with Snape's help, but Draco Malfoy had disarmed Dumbledore in the Astronomy Tower before Snape struck the killing blow. Thus Draco, not Snape, unknowingly became the wand's new master. This single detail unravelled the entire logic of Voldemort's decision. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry explains this to Voldemort during their final confrontation. It was Draco Malfoy who disarmed Dumbledore that night in the Astronomy Tower. From that moment, the wand recognized him as its master. Harry's own victory over Draco later at Malfoy Manor shifted the wand's allegiance once again, this time to Harry. Voldemort, entirely unaware of this chain of events, committed one of the most critical mistakes of his life, eliminating a man who posed no threat and killing for the wrong reason. The boathouse murder becomes even more tragic when viewed through the lens of Snape's character. Severus Snape was not merely a double agent. He was a man trapped between guilt, duty, and love. His true allegiance had always been to Lily Potter's memory and to the son she left behind. Dumbledore had trusted him with a terrible task, to kill him when the time was right, and Snape had complied, not out of ambition, but out of obedience and heartbreak. Voldemort, in his blind ambition, saw only a pawn. He failed to recognize the depth of Snape's loyalty or the tragedy of the role he played. When Voldemort killed Snape, he did more than make a strategic error. He discarded one of the few people who had consistently acted out of motives more complex than fear or loyalty. Snape had never truly been Voldemort's follower, and the Dark Lord's inability to recognize that further highlights how little he understood those around him. The moment the snake's fangs sank into Snape's neck, Voldemort not only lost the chance to grasp the wand's true allegiance, but also extinguished a man who held the final key to understanding it. Magic, in the world of Harry Potter, is not merely a tool. It is a living, breathing extension of will and connection. Wands, especially those as ancient and powerful as the Elder Wand, respond not only to actions but to intention, to emotion, to conquest in the purest sense. Voldemort's fatal flaw was his belief that magic could be controlled like a beast. He believed dominance alone secured loyalty, that fear equaled submission. But the Elder Wand had a will of its own. Its true allegiance lay not with the murderer, but with the victor. In the Forbidden Forest, when Voldemort used the Elder Wand to strike down Harry, it resisted him. Though the spells seemed to succeed, Harry survived, not through luck, but because the wand refused to kill its master. This quiet rebellion by the wand was the first clear sign that Voldemort's hold over magic was crumbling. The very instrument he believed would cement his rule had turned against him. The climax of this arc comes when Harry, in the final duel, disarms Voldemort, not with overwhelming power, but with truth and understanding on his side. Voldemort's end is not simply a defeat in battle. It is the slow, inevitable collapse of a man who refused to learn. He dismissed the wisdom of others, twisted prophecy to suit his fears, and placed his trust in artifacts he barely comprehended. The murder of Snape encapsulates all these failures. It is an act devoid of empathy, but more crucially, devoid of knowledge. It reveals the weakness of a mind so obsessed with domination that it never questioned its own assumptions. The symbolism of Snape's death in the boathouse is haunting. Drenched in blood, dying alone, he offers Harry a final piece of the puzzle, his memories. In this moment, Snape's life becomes a mirror to Voldemort's failure. Where Voldemort killed for power, Snape died for love. Where Voldemort sought to control, Snape sought to protect. The contrast between them is painful and poetic. The murder that Voldemort believed would guarantee him victory instead set the stage for his greatest defeat. Voldemort's downfall is not merely written in spells and duels, it is etched in the small, overlooked moments where he chooses pride over curiosity, destruction over understanding. The Elder Wand, ancient and wise, refused to serve someone who never respected the true laws of magic. Its final act of rebellion was not a burst of power, but quiet disobedience, a refusal to respond, a rejection of the Dark Lord's authority. In trying to possess the wand through murder, Voldemort violated the very spirit of its legacy. When Harry catches the wand during their final duel, the story comes full circle. He does not seek to keep it, he breaks it and casts it away, ending a cycle of violence that Voldemort perpetuated. This moment emphasizes the true lesson that Voldemort never learned, that power without wisdom is empty. By killing Snape, Voldemort attempted to rewrite the laws of magic in his favor. But magic, like truth, cannot be bent by will alone. The tragedy of Voldemort's decision is not just strategic, it is deeply human. He chose the path of fear and destruction over reflection and knowledge. He ignored the importance of intent, of choice, of connection. His world was one of absolutes: kill or be killed, rule or be ruled. In such a world, the subtlety of wand law had no place, and so it betrayed him. Snape, misunderstood until the end, became the final mirror in which Voldemort's failures were reflected back at him. Thus, the murder in the boathouse becomes more than just another death. It is the final step in a chain of mistakes that reveal Voldemort's tragic flaw, his inability to understand what truly governs the magical world. Not fear, not blood, but love, loyalty, and the quiet, invisible threads of fate that bind wand to wizard, victory to wisdom. By misunderstanding those threads, Voldemort severed his own. Number 20. Death Eaters torturing Neville at Hogwarts. When Voldemort seized control of the wizarding world, he reshaped its institutions in his own image, none more visibly than Hogwarts. The once vibrant school was turned into a grim fortress of oppression, no longer a sanctuary for learning, but a laboratory of fear. The Carrow siblings, Alecto and Amicus, were placed in charge, tasked with enforcing Voldemort's ideology among the young. Their methods were not just strict, they were sadistic. The school's walls echoed not with laughter or spells, but with the screams of punished students. Into this nightmare stepped Neville Longbottom, a boy often overlooked, now standing alone against monsters in human form. Neville's resistance did not begin as a grand rebellion. It started with quiet refusals, brave words, and acts of defiance that were almost invisible to outsiders. Yet the Carrows noticed. They recognized in Neville not the weak student he once was, but a spark that could light a fire. They had the power to snuff it out with a single curse, but they didn't. Instead, they chose humiliation. Amicus made him the example, dragging him before other students, cursing him in class, beating him in front of first years. It was a show of dominance designed to break him, and it was the beginning of their mistake. Their cruelty did not breed submission. It forged a leader. Every time Neville was punished, he returned stronger. His resolve hardened like iron struck on an anvil. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it is mentioned that they used the Cruciatus curse on kids who earned detentions, and Neville had earned more than anyone. Each lash, each spell cast upon him in hatred turned him into the symbol that students clung to in silence. Where Voldemort wanted a broken generation, he was instead creating a secret army. The Carrows never understood Neville. To them, he was a slow-witted boy with a forgetful streak. They underestimated the fire inside him. Even Professor Snape, who had now become headmaster under Voldemort's regime, seemed to allow Neville's existence as long as he didn't challenge the system too openly. But the Carrows pushed further. They didn't simply punish Neville, they used him to inspire fear, forcing him to watch others suffer. They believed public brutality would fracture the unity of students. Instead, it united them in rage. Neville did not act alone. His courage became a magnet. Luna Lovegood, Ginny Weasley, and others began to form the new Dumbledore's army. Secret meetings were held in the Room of Requirement, now a sanctuary hidden in plain sight. The magical room responded to the need of its users, and in this dark time it became a haven for rebels. Neville, once unsure and hesitant, became its de facto leader. He found hidden corridors, organized food supplies, and even found ways to sneak in students who were being hunted. His leadership was born not of ambition, but of pain. The Carrows had crafted their own nemesis. One moment stands out as a symbol of this transformation. When Neville was caught trying to protect a first year from being tortured, Amicus struck him across the face, drawing blood in front of a dozen students. The room was silent. No one dared to intervene. But Neville, with blood dripping from his chin, looked straight into Amicus's eyes and didn't flinch. That single act of defiance became legend. Whispers of it spread through the school. The students no longer saw a boy, they saw resistance incarnate. Even more damning was how this cruelty backfired on the Death Eaters' strategy. They wanted to control Hogwarts to indoctrinate the next generation. But fear turned into anger. Their propaganda crumbled. The very classes where they taught hatred and dark arts became places of quiet revolt. Students learned the theory of the Cruciatus curse not to use it, but to endure it. They learned to resist mentally even when the body failed. Every punishment birthed a lesson in resilience. Voldemort's plan to poison the minds of children had, instead, trained his enemies. Neville's transformation also reshaped his identity. He had always been known as the boy who could barely cast a proper spell in his first year. He was the clumsy kid who lost his toad, Trevor. But by the time Harry returned to Hogwarts, Neville had become unrecognizable. When he greeted Harry in the room of requirement, he was covered in bruises, limping and smiling. "They've used the Cruciatus curse on me a couple of times already," he said in the book, not with despair, but with pride. He had become a warrior. In many ways, the Carrows created what Voldemort feared the most: hope. The tyrants of history often try to extinguish hope because it cannot be chained or silenced. They tried to crush Neville through public beatings and instead made him a martyr. He became the one students looked to when they had no one else. When he spoke, they listened. When he stood, they followed. Their rebellion grew, not through bloodshed, but through the unspoken bonds of the oppressed. The Carrows had planted a seed they couldn't uproot. The ultimate irony came during the Battle of Hogwarts. When Voldemort summoned everyone to witness his supposed victory, Neville stepped forward once more. This time he faced the Dark Lord himself. He was offered a chance to join the Death Eaters, but the boy, who once feared his own shadow, now drew the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and struck down Nagini, the final Horcrux. With that act, the war turned. Voldemort's soul could now be destroyed, all because the Carrows hadn't killed him when they had the chance. Voldemort's army failed not because of lack of power, but because they misunderstood the human spirit. They saw kindness as weakness, compassion as naivety. They mistook cruelty for control. Neville Longbottom, who should have been a broken shell, stood taller than giants. His courage was not theatrical but real, forged in isolation and pain. The Carrows didn't see that each time they struck him, they were tempering something far more dangerous than they could comprehend: belief. Even in the darkest of times, Neville remembered who he was fighting for. He kept photos of the original Dumbledore's army. He carved the names of the fallen into the stone walls of the Room of Requirement. He taught first years how to cast protective spells and showed them how to keep hope alive. It was never about glory for him. It was about refusing to let Hogwarts become a place of terror. He had no prophecy, no chosen destiny, and yet he fulfilled a role as important as Harry's. In punishing Neville, the Carrows not only failed to break him, they elevated him. They did not extinguish the light, they turned it into a beacon. He became proof that even in a world of darkness, one ordinary person could become extraordinary. Hogwarts did not fall under Voldemort's rule. It endured, and that endurance had a face, bruised, bloodied, but unbroken. It was Neville's face. Alecto and Amicus, in their arrogance, had assumed that torture would lead to compliance. They believed fear was the strongest tool in a dictator's arsenal. What they didn't realize was that children adapt. They rise. They find ways to survive. In this, the very youth they tried to destroy ended up being the architects of their own defeat. The Carrows never left Hogwarts in triumph. They were found. Tied up, unconscious, defeated not by auras but by students. Their reign had ended in humiliation, and so history turned on a small, overlooked choice. The Carrows could have silenced Neville early. They had the means, but they chose to showcase him thinking it would scare the others. Instead, it inspired them. That is the paradox of tyranny. In seeking to dominate, it often creates the very resistance it fears most. Neville Longbottom was not born a hero. He was shaped by suffering, and in the end, it was that suffering, not prophecy or fate, that turned him into the destroyer of Voldemort's last Horcrux. Number 21. Voldemort failing to understand the power of love. Voldemort's downfall did not begin with a prophecy or a wand duel. It began long before, in the shadowed corners of a boy's heart that never learned what it meant to love or be loved. Tom Riddle, from the moment he first opened his eyes in the sterile walls of the orphanage, viewed affection as a foreign currency, one that could neither be trusted nor traded. This early detachment was not just emotional, it was foundational. The boy who would become Voldemort never formed bonds, never tasted the warmth of loyalty or sacrifice. Instead, he honed charm into manipulation and curiosity into control. To him, love was a weakness wielded by fools, not a force worth understanding. And thus, from the very start, he was at war with something he didn't even try to comprehend. This blind spot did not disappear with age. As he grew in power, gathering followers and crafting Horcruxes, Voldemort continued to scoff at the idea that emotions could matter in battle. Power was all that existed to him, raw, pure, and absolute. He believed that to master death was to master everything. But what he failed to see, and what would ultimately undo him, was that love was not the opposite of power. Love was power in its most enduring form. He treated it like a forgotten spell, a useless relic in the arsenal of the weak. And in doing so, he left himself fatally vulnerable. The night he walked into the Potter cottage in Godric's Hollow, Voldemort was certain of his triumph. Armed with the most feared wand and centuries of dark knowledge, he faced a defenseless baby. But Lily Potter stood between him and the child, not with a wand, but with love. She did not flee. She did not beg for herself. She chose death so that her son might live, and in that act she invoked a magic older than any curse Voldemort could cast. To have been loved so deeply, Dumbledore later explained, will give us some protection forever. Voldemort had no category in his mind for such an act. He reduced it to mere sentiment, never realizing it was a spell stronger than Avada Kedavra itself. This protection clung to Harry like invisible armor. When Voldemort tried to kill him, the curse rebounded, destroying the Dark Lord's body and marking Harry not as a victim, but as a survivor. It wasn't the boy's skill nor his lineage that saved him. It was love, Lily's love. But Voldemort dismissed this anomaly as a magical fluke. He refused to examine the nature of what had protected Harry. Instead of questioning how such an outcome was possible, he focused only on regaining his body and finishing what he had started. Thus, even when fate handed him a clue to his failure, he remained blind to it. Years later, when Voldemort returned to power and began to hunt Harry again, he made the same mistake. At the Department of Mysteries, he tried to possess Harry's body to demonstrate his superiority, but again he failed. Harry, overwhelmed with grief for Sirius and filled with raw, human love for his lost godfather, proved impossible to control. "You're the weak one," Harry thought as Voldemort fled his body, "and you'll never know love or friendship." In that moment, Voldemort's greatest fear was not pain, but something worse, the echo of a world he could not touch, a world where people fought not for power, but for one another. Throughout the war, Voldemort underestimated the bonds between people. He viewed Harry's friendships as childish attachments. He failed to see the strength Ron and Hermione gave Harry, or how the Order of the Phoenix operated not through fear, but through mutual loyalty. He believed his Death Eaters were stronger because they were bound by terror. But when the final battles came, his followers fled, while Harry's allies stood. Even when Hogwarts was crumbling and death was everywhere, the students, the teachers, and the families chose to fight. Not for glory, not for survival, but for love. This was not strategy, this was heart. And Voldemort could never lead such a force, because he could never inspire love. The irony was cruel. Voldemort, the master of death, spent his life tearing his soul apart to escape mortality. Yet he failed to realize that immortality already existed, just not in the form he craved. Lily's love outlived her. The people who loved Sirius remembered him and passed on his story. Dumbledore, flawed and secretive, remained beloved long after his death because he cared. Even Severus Snape, tormented and bitter, found redemption in the lingering love he carried for Lily Evans. After all this time? Always. That single word shattered more illusions than any curse Voldemort ever cast. Snape himself is one of the most poignant examples of what Voldemort could never understand. Here was a man who had served the Dark Lord, who had committed terrible acts, but who changed not out of fear, but out of love. His loyalty to Dumbledore, his protection of Harry, his silent suffering, all stemmed from one childhood affection that never died. Love turned him from villain to hero, and Voldemort never saw it coming. He used Snape as a pawn, unaware that the man's true allegiance lay with a memory and a promise, not with power. Even in the final moments of his life, Voldemort remained trapped in his misunderstanding. At the Battle of Hogwarts, when Harry stepped out of the forest and revealed he had sacrificed himself, Voldemort still could not comprehend the depth of that act. Harry had willingly walked to death, not to defeat Voldemort with violence, but to save others. Like his mother before him, he chose love over life. And once again, that magic became a shield. When Voldemort fired the killing curse in the Great Hall, it was his own spell that rebounded, because the Elder Wand, like all true power, recognized love as its master, not domination. The wand itself served as the final metaphor. The Elder Wand, the Death Stick, was meant to belong to the strongest wizard. Voldemort believed strength came from fear, control, and death. But the wand refused him because its allegiance had shifted not through murder, but through loyalty. Harry had disarmed Draco, who had disarmed Dumbledore. The thread of allegiance followed human connection, not bloodshed. Even in objects the laws Voldemort lived by crumbled. The magic he so carefully wielded turned against him because he had never understood its heart. Love in the world of Harry Potter is not a passive feeling. It is a force, a decision, a sacrifice, a strength. It binds people across time and space, across death and memory. Voldemort, who feared death more than anything, never realized that the opposite of death was not life, it was love. Life ends, but love continues. That is why Harry became the true master of death, not because he conquered it, but because he accepted it, embraced it, and walked through it for the sake of others. In contrast, Voldemort's entire life was a refusal. He refused connection, refused empathy, refused even the chance to change. His soul was so fractured that he could not hold on to his own humanity. In the end, his body collapsed, and no one mourned him. No one remembered him with affection. He left no legacy, only fear and ashes, and fear fades. His name was once forbidden to speak, but after his death it lost all power. People said it freely, not with dread, but with dismissal. He had tried to make himself eternal, and became nothing. The boy who grew up without love died without it. The man who feared death found no one to stand beside him. The wizard who broke the laws of nature to conquer mortality was defeated by the one force he never studied. Love is not an easy magic. It asks everything. But in the world J.K. Rowling created, it is the only magic that lasts. Voldemort's greatest mistake was never a spell, a Horcrux, or a duel. It was the arrogance to believe that love was beneath him. And in that mistake, he doomed himself. Love demanded sacrifice. Voldemort sacrificed nothing. Love demanded understanding. Voldemort listened to no one. Love demanded vulnerability, and Voldemort wrapped himself in cruelty like armor. But armor cannot hug a child or hold a friend or redeem a life. It can only protect, and sometimes what you need is not protection, but surrender. Voldemort never learned that. Harry did. And that is why one boy lived while the other perished, not because of power, but because of love. Number 22. Lucius Malfoy losing influence in the ministry. Lucius Malfoy, heir to one of the oldest pure-blood families in wizarding Britain, stood at the very core of Voldemort's ideology. Wealth, power, heritage, Lucius had it all. He was the polished face of the Dark Lord's aristocratic agenda, the kind of man who, with a mere glance and the right handshake, could make things shift in the Ministry. And yet, in the most critical moment of the Second Wizarding War, Lucius became not a pillar, but a fracture. It began long before the war took full shape, when his vanity clouded judgment and his desire to impress overpowered strategy. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lucius handed a Horcrux, the diary of Tom Riddle, to an 11-year-old girl. That moment, casual and smug, was the first pebble that would start an avalanche of mistakes. The diary was not just a cursed object. It was a piece of Voldemort's soul, a sacred relic in the plans of immortality. And Lucius Malfoy, too, caught up in his personal vendetta against Arthur Weasley, and his Muggle Protection Act slipped it into Ginny Weasley's cauldron without informing his master. His motivation was political sabotage, not strategy. In his mind, exposing Dumbledore's failures by unleashing chaos at Hogwarts would be a triumph. Instead, the diary was destroyed, and a fragment of Voldemort's soul with it. The Dark Lord would not forget, nor would he forgive. When Voldemort returned, it was with full knowledge of Lucius's recklessness, but he was still needed for a time. Lucius's position within the Ministry should have made him an ideal agent of infiltration. He was close to key officials, respected by many and feared by more. But instead of building influence discreetly, Lucius escalated his involvement in operations that were loud, visible, and clumsy. His participation in the mission to retrieve the prophecy from the Department of Mysteries was a complete failure. The plan, which required subtlety, ended in catastrophe. 5 teenage students, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood, slipped past the Death Eaters and a battle ensued. The prophecy orb was shattered. Voldemort's vital link to understanding the terms of his survival, his vulnerability, vanished in Lucius's grasp. His mistake cost the Dark Lord vital knowledge and exposed their operations to the wizarding public. That mission marked the beginning of Lucius's public downfall. Captured and sent to Azkaban, he lost his seat of power. He became a symbol, not of the Dark Lord's rise, but of his incompetence. Worse still, the raid at the Department of Mysteries revealed an unspoken truth. Lucius was not a warrior. He was not Bellatrix Lestrange, fierce and fanatical. He was not Barty Crouch Jr., cunning and devoted. Lucius was a man of expensive robes, political games, and ancestral pride. In battle, he faltered. He had no contingency plan. He had no grasp of improvisation. The moment things went awry, he looked lost, uncertain, weak, and Voldemort loathed weakness. When the Malfoys were released from Azkaban following Voldemort's open return, Lucius was no longer viewed as a trusted lieutenant. He was a tool, useful but replaceable. His home was seized as headquarters. His wand, his most personal magical instrument, was confiscated. Voldemort used it without hesitation, a mark of domination so deeply symbolic it shattered what remained of Lucius's dignity. "My wand, Lucius, I require your wand," said Voldemort in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. It wasn't a request. It was an assertion of absolute control, a reminder that Lucius had nothing left that was truly his. Even as Voldemort's forces spread terror across the wizarding world, Lucius began to deteriorate. He no longer issued commands at the Ministry. He no longer wielded fear in public. His confidence drained. His home, once a fortress of pure-blood supremacy, became a prison for the Dark Lord's enemies. When the captured Harry, Ron, and Hermione were dragged into Malfoy Manor by snatchers, Lucius barely recognized his opportunity. He failed to identify Harry Potter, a prize that could have restored his status. Instead, he hesitated, unsure, panicked. Narcissa pleaded. Draco stalled. And Bellatrix, ever the predator, took control. The Order of the Phoenix later rescued them from that very house. Once again, the Malfoys had failed. The dissent was visible. Lucius stopped speaking in meetings. He avoided confrontation. His eyes darted around rooms filled with Death Eaters like a man scanning for exits. He no longer held leverage over others. People no longer feared his name. The Malfoy crest meant nothing under Voldemort's regime. He had allowed his family's legacy to become a joke among the inner circle. The aristocrat who once sneered at the Weasleys had become a ghost of himself, reduced to desperate glances and trembling hands. His fall was not dramatic. It was slow, humiliating, and utterly devoid of redemption, at least in the eyes of Voldemort. What sealed his irrelevance, perhaps more than any tactical error, was his transformation into a father above all. When Voldemort ordered Draco to kill Dumbledore, Lucius watched helplessly as his son was dragged into the war. He could not protect him. He could not oppose the Dark Lord. His power had eroded too far. His wife, Narcissa, ultimately did what Lucius never could, lie to Voldemort to protect her child. In that act of maternal defiance, she preserved what remained of their family. Lucius, meanwhile, stood silent, defeated. Even his silence in that moment felt cowardly, not cautious. There was no courage left in him. Every decision Lucius made in the Second Wizarding War stemmed from panic. Panic to maintain appearances, panic to preserve influence, panic to protect his family. But panic is no substitute for leadership. At every turn, he chose short-term gain over long-term stability. He acted without coordination. He misjudged his allies. He underestimated his enemies. From the diary in Ginny's Cauldron to the battle in the Department of Mysteries, Lucius acted like a man playing at war, not fighting one. He was not alone in making mistakes, but his were more visible, more costly, and far less forgivable. It is telling that in the final battle at Hogwarts, Lucius did not fight. He did not stand with Voldemort, nor did he join the defenders. He was not a man of action. He was a man torn apart by consequences. As the tide turned, he searched for Draco. He moved through the chaos, not with a wand raised, but with desperation. His only objective was to retrieve his son, not to shape the future of the wizarding world. And that perhaps was the true cost of his misjudgments. He had lost any role in history. He was no longer a player, he was a bystander. Lucius's story is not just one of failure, it is one of disintegration. The collapse of his influence, the loss of Voldemort's trust, and the erosion of his own identity as a leader were not the results of one mistake, but of many. They were born from arrogance, festered through fear, and sealed by inaction. He started as the puppet master, the whisperer behind ministerial curtains. He ended as the man who couldn't recognize Harry Potter when he stood in his hallway. No quote better reflects Lucius's demise than Voldemort's simple, chilling demand, "Give me your wand." In that moment, the old world died. The Malfoy name, once inscribed in golden lettering across generations of Slytherins, was reduced to a tool in the hands of a man who no longer needed loyalty, only obedience. And Lucius, in giving up his wand, gave up what little he had left. He was not evil in the way Bellatrix was. He was not brave in the way Severus Snape would prove to be. He hovered in the middle, defined by indecision, veiled aggression, and social maneuvering that failed to survive the brutality of war. When faced with real resistance, he cowered. When given second chances, he squandered them. And when his family needed a leader, he leaned on his wife instead. Lucius Malfoy should have been Voldemort's greatest weapon inside the Ministry. He had access, knowledge, prestige. Instead, he became a liability, a cautionary tale of how power without conviction is just decoration. His errors are not just strategic footnotes, they are turning points. They shaped the war as much as the victories of the Order. And in the end, when Voldemort lay defeated, Lucius was not celebrated or cursed. He was simply forgotten. Number 23, Bellatrix Lestrange killing Dobby. When Bellatrix Lestrange hurled that silver knife across the air, it wasn't a strategic act of war. It wasn't even a carefully calculated maneuver to stop the escape of dangerous fugitives. It was a flash of hatred, sharpened by cruelty, and aimed not at Harry Potter, not at Hermione Granger, not even at Ron Weasley, but at a house elf. A creature the Death Eaters, in their arrogant ideology, saw as inferior and expendable. And yet in that careless act of violence, Bellatrix unknowingly forged a moment that would harden Harry's soul, ignite his purpose, and immortalize a hero whose courage had never needed a wand. Dobby the house elf had just completed one of the most daring rescues in the Wizarding War. He had infiltrated Malfoy Manor, home of his former enslavers, and defied the darkest forces in the wizarding world. He disarmed Narcissa Malfoy, freed Luna Lovegood, Ollivander, and Dean Thomas from the cellar, and apparated with Harry and his friends to safety. This act of defiance, selflessness, and bravery was, by all accounts, a blow to the Death Eater's authority. Yet Bellatrix's decision to kill him was not out of tactical revenge. Her eyes, wild with fury, reflected something deeper. Disdain for what Dobby represented, freedom, rebellion, and loyalty to something greater than fear. She could have thrown the knife at Harry, at Ron, at any one of the teenagers who posed a true threat to Voldemort's plan. But in choosing Dobby, she revealed a fatal flaw common among Voldemort's followers, a chronic underestimation of love, sacrifice, and moral strength. Dobby was not armed, he was not fighting, he was helping, and in Bellatrix's twisted worldview, such help was weakness. Her knife was meant to silence it, but it did not. As the characters reappeared on Shell Cottage's shore, the sharp pain of loss overshadowed their relief. Dobby is happy to be with his friend, Harry Potter. Those were his final words, spoken with the kind of sincerity that Voldemort's army could never understand. J.K. Rowling described the moment with heart-wrenching precision. Dobby's eyes were wide open, and his body trembled with the effort of keeping Harry safe, before going still in his arms. In that instant, the grief Harry felt wasn't just for a lost friend. It was for the innocents crushed by the war, and it changed him. Until that moment, Harry had been driven by a mixture of instinct and anger. He had operated in the shadows of Dumbledore's plan, never quite certain of what the next step should be. But as he buried Dobby without magic, digging each handful of earth with raw hands, something shifted. The boy who had once flinched at his destiny now embraced it with quiet fury. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf," the stone read, and beneath it lay not just a body, but the cost of freedom. Bellatrix's error wasn't just in wasting her energy on what she deemed a minor threat. It was in demonstrating to Harry exactly what he was fighting for. The cruelty of her act stripped away the last of his hesitation. It was no longer about Horcruxes or prophecies. It became personal. It became about protecting the ones who could not protect themselves, about ensuring that no one, elf or wizard, would have to suffer under the heel of tyranny. This death did what Voldemort's endless torture and murder could not. It crystallized Harry's resolve. When the trio resumed their mission, Harry no longer hesitated to take risks. He trusted his instincts more, made bolder decisions, and no longer doubted the path he had to take. Dobby's death wasn't in vain. It was a spark that lit a fire within him, one that Bellatrix could never have foreseen. The irony of the moment lies in the nature of the Death Eaters themselves. Bellatrix, for all her cruelty, was considered one of the most dangerous among them. Her duels were legendary. She had bested Sirius Black and tortured countless others. And yet, in that one impulsive act, throwing a knife into the void of apparition, she sealed her own fate. Because Dobby's death galvanized the very forces she sought to destroy. She underestimated Dobby because she could not comprehend the kind of strength he embodied. To Bellatrix, servitude was natural, and defiance from a creature like Dobby was obscene. But it was precisely because of his background, his chains, his silence, his scars, that Dobby's final act rang with such power. He was the symbol of every voiceless soul under Voldemort's regime. and in dying he gave them all a voice. It is telling that Harry never forgot that moment. He carried the weight of it through every step afterward. Even during the Battle of Hogwarts, when the stakes were as high as they had ever been, the memory of Dobby's sacrifice loomed large. Harry knew the enemy's weakness now. It wasn't physical strength or magical power. It was their complete inability to understand the power of compassion. Rowling weaved this theme carefully into the narrative. In Deathly Hallows, the importance of sacrifice and humble bravery reaches its crescendo. Dobby's death is not just an emotional beat, it's a narrative pivot. It moves the story from one of desperate survival to one of deliberate confrontation. Harry stops running and starts fighting. The contrast between Bellatrix's hatred and Dobby's love is deliberate. She represents everything twisted in the wizarding world: supremacy, cruelty, and blind devotion to power. Dobby, on the other hand, stands for innocence reclaimed, strength through kindness, and the courage to disobey evil. His was not a dramatic sacrifice made in a blaze of glory. It was quiet, immediate, and intimate. And perhaps that's why it cuts so deeply. It's also significant that Harry chose to bury Dobby by hand. In a world where magic could have summoned a grave with a flick of the wand, this act stood as a testimony to the worth of the life lost. It was a ritual, a moment of mourning that elevated Dobby's life to one of legendary stature. Bellatrix may have thought she was killing a servant. What she did was martyr a hero. The knife Bellatrix threw was not enchanted. It was not aimed with the precision of a spell. It was wild, angry, and impulsive, and it found its mark. But that randomness only adds to the symbolism. The idea that hatred, once released, cannot be controlled. It strikes where it will. Bellatrix's hatred killed a creature she never believed could fight back. And yet, the repercussions of that moment spiraled beyond her comprehension. Her lack of foresight mirrors Voldemort's. The entire Death Eater ideology was built on the assumption that fear and domination would subdue the world. But again and again they failed to see that the true power lay elsewhere, in loyalty, love, and sacrifice. Dobby's death was a reminder that the smallest, most underestimated among them could still shape the course of the war. Bellatrix Lestrange was eventually killed by Molly Weasley, another figure the Death Eaters likely dismissed. A mother, not a warrior. But like Dobby, Molly fought with a power the Death Eaters never understood: love. When she screamed, "Not my daughter, you bitch," it wasn't a spell that rang through the battlefield. It was the echo of every injustice Bellatrix had committed, including the murder of a free elf on a beach. Dobby's grave remains untouched, even in the years after the war. It stands not just as a tribute to a brave friend, but as a reminder of the war's most important lesson, that courage often comes from the unlikeliest places, and that evil, no matter how powerful, will always falter in the face of true selflessness. Bellatrix tried to extinguish a flicker of hope. Instead, she ignited a fire that would consume everything she fought to protect. Number 24, Voldemort, trusting his own followers. Even as Lord Voldemort's power grew to its peak and the wizarding world trembled at the mere whisper of his name, a fatal flaw quietly hollowed out his campaign from within. He never truly trusted anyone, not even those closest to him, those who bore the dark mark with pride, who murdered in his name, or who begged for his favor. He ruled not through loyalty, but through fear, and that fear, while potent, was unstable. It cracked under pressure, exposed weakness in moments of crisis, and ultimately left him isolated. In contrast, the Order of the Phoenix, disparate, wounded, and often outnumbered, held firm through bonds of trust. While Harry Potter shared his soul with two loyal companions who would follow him into fire, Voldemort stood alone in a cold echo chamber of suspicion. Lucius Malfoy, once the embodiment of Voldemort's noble ambitions, fell swiftly from grace. After the debacle at the Department of Mysteries, where the prophecies slipped through his fingers and into Dumbledore's hands, Lucius was thrown into Azkaban without a second thought. The punishment wasn't simply strategic, it was symbolic. Voldemort no longer trusted him. No redemption, no second chance, no subtle words of reassurance. Just silence. Later, Lucius was allowed back into Voldemort's circle, but he returned, diminished, disgraced, his wand taken from him, his voice quieter, his gaze always lowered. The failure wasn't just his, it was Voldemort's refusal to empower him anew. A true leader might have rebuilt his general. Voldemort simply replaced him. Bellatrix Lestrange, fanatical, devoted, utterly consumed by her worship of the Dark Lord, might have seemed an exception, but even she was kept at a distance from the inner sanctum of Voldemort's plans. Her love for him, twisted and blind, was not enough to earn complete trust. She knew not of the Horcruxes, nor of the true purpose of the locket, the cup, the diadem. When she stored Helga Hufflepuff's cup in the Lestrange vault, it was not because Voldemort trusted her, but because he trusted the enchantments of Gringotts. Bellatrix was not the guardian of his secret. She was a pawn in a strategy of misdirection and concealment. Her eventual downfall, screaming in fury as the cup was stolen, was a direct result of being kept in the dark. And then there was Severus Snape, the ultimate enigma. Voldemort kept Snape close, praised him, relied on him to pass false information to the Order, yet even Snape was never granted access to the Dark Lord's soul-splitting secrets. Voldemort boasted of immortality but never revealed the truth of the Horcruxes, never once considered sharing the burden of their protection. Snape was trusted only insofar as he remained useful. When Voldemort finally chose to murder him, believing mistakenly that the Elder Wand owed its allegiance to Snape, the fatal irony was sharp. The one who had risked everything, who had walked the knife's edge between light and darkness for years, was discarded with cold efficiency. Voldemort never stopped to ask himself whether Snape might have been his most valuable asset. The snake, Nagini, was perhaps the most curious victim of Voldemort's possessiveness. Bound to him more closely than any human, she was made into a Horcrux, a literal container of his soul. And yet even with her, Voldemort acted not with care, but with obsessive control. He shielded her inside a magical sphere at the Battle of Hogwarts, not from compassion, but to protect what she contained. Nagini was not a companion, she was a vessel. He spoke Parseltongue to her, issued commands, allowed her to kill, but in the end she was just another object of power. When Neville Longbottom severed her head with the sword of Gryffindor, Voldemort lost not only a fragment of his soul, but the only creature he had kept by his side without question. And still, she had never truly been trusted. Throughout the war, Voldemort made it a point never to reveal the full extent of his intentions. The Death Eaters followed orders, executed assassinations, spread terror, but they were always operating with partial information. No one knew the entirety of the plan, not for the resurrection of his body, not for the manipulation of the Ministry, not for the final battle at Hogwarts. His army was not united by a shared vision, but fragmented by secrecy and fear. The result was chaos. When the tide turned and Voldemort was forced to retreat into the shadows again, many of his followers fled or turned on one another. Rookwood, Travers, the Carrows, they did not stand firm, they sought survival. Meanwhile, the Order of the Phoenix, smaller, underfunded and wounded by loss, demonstrated a cohesion Voldemort never achieved. Kingsley Shacklebolt trusted Remus Lupin with covert missions. Arthur Weasley stood shoulder to shoulder with Minerva McGonagall. Molly Weasley trusted her children's lives to Dumbledore's vision. Even when doubts and tragedies arose, the deaths of Sirius and Dumbledore, the betrayal of Mundungus Fletcher, the Order regrouped, mourned together, and moved forward. Their strength was never in numbers, but in unity. Harry Potter, in particular, showed Voldemort the price of emotional isolation. Despite being hunted, possessed and tortured, Harry never wavered in his trust toward Ron and Hermione. When he chose to leave the burrow and search for the Horcruxes, he did not do it alone. He did not lie, he did not conceal. He invited his friends into danger with open eyes. When Dobby died, they buried him with love. When Ron abandoned them, Harry waited for him to return. When Hermione was tortured, Harry held her hand. The trio survived not because they were powerful, but because they were inseparable. Voldemort's refusal to build that kind of trust was not simply cold, it was foolish. He believed vulnerability came through attachment. "There is nothing worse than death," he declared, dismissing Dumbledore's deeper understanding. But he was wrong. Worse than death is dying alone, mistrusted, and unloved. At the climax of the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort called for Harry to surrender. He offered false mercy, not realizing that Harry had already made peace with death. "You don't know love," Harry told him. "You don't know friendship." It was not an insult. It was the simple truth. When Voldemort faced his final moments in the Great Hall, surrounded by the bodies of those he had betrayed or discarded, he stood alone. No Death Eaters flanked him, no trusted advisor whispered in his ear, no friend held his hand. He raised the Elder Wand, a wand he did not own, against a boy who had known nothing but loss and still chosen love. And when the curse rebounded, Voldemort fell, not with dignity or mourning, but with silence. No one cried out. No one rushed to his side. His death was not just a physical end. It was the final consequence of a life built on distrust. Every Horcrux he created was a testament to that fear, an unwillingness to believe in others, to place part of himself in their care. He split his soul not only magically, but emotionally. He fractured every relationship, poisoned every alliance, until only obedience remained. But obedience is not loyalty, and loyalty is not love. And love, as Dumbledore knew, is the only magic Voldemort could never comprehend. The strategic weakness of Voldemort's method became evident not in grand battles, but in subtle cracks. Draco Malfoy, given an impossible mission, broke under pressure. Narcissa Malfoy, in a moment of maternal desperation, lied to Voldemort and saved Harry's life. Peter Pettigrew, once his loyal servant, hesitated and paid with his life. Every moment of betrayal was born not out of rebellion, but out of the absence of trust. The foundation had never been laid. They had followed Voldemort's orders, but never shared his dreams. Voldemort's empire, then, was always doomed to collapse, not because his magic was weak or his followers insufficient, but because he built it on fear. Fear commands obedience, but it cannot inspire sacrifice. It does not withstand doubt. It does not forge legends. And when the final war was waged, Voldemort stood atop a crumbling tower of dread, while Harry, barely 17, stood unarmed and resolute, backed by friends who would die for him. Had Voldemort chosen differently, had he confided in Snape, empowered Bellatrix, forgiven Lucius, believed in Draco, trusted even one of them, perhaps the war would have ended differently, but he could not. Trust required surrender, and surrender was weakness in his eyes. Yet it was in surrender that Harry found strength, the willingness to die, to love, to believe in something greater than power. Voldemort believed that ruling through fear made him invincible, but in the end, it only made him alone. And alone, he was nothing. Number 25. Voldemort, returning to Hogwarts after killing Harry. Lord Voldemort stood in the Forbidden Forest, triumphant and invincible, staring down at the lifeless body of the boy who lived. Harry Potter had walked willingly to his death, and for the first time in years, the Dark Lord tasted the sweetness of what he believed to be total victory. The Chosen One had fallen without resistance, and the Elder Wand, stolen from Dumbledore's tomb and now in Voldemort's hand, seemed to hum with anticipation. The forest was silent save for the tense murmurs of the Death Eaters surrounding their master. The war, it seemed, was over. Yet in that moment of supposed supremacy, Voldemort made a decision that would unravel everything. He chose not to press his advantage, not to end the fight there and then. Instead, he returned to Hogwarts with Harry's body in tow, seeking to flaunt his victory rather than solidify it. As he marched toward the castle, Voldemort envisioned the impact of his spectacle. He would humiliate the defenders of Hogwarts, break their will, and offer them one final chance to surrender. The sight of Harry's limp form carried in Hagrid's arms would crush the last remnants of hope. That, Voldemort believed, was the key to total domination, not merely killing his enemies, but ensuring their souls were extinguished long before death arrived. He desired not just obedience, but submission, and so he delayed the final blow, opting instead for a twisted parade through the heart of the castle he had long despised. But this decision, born of arrogance and hunger for psychological triumph, gave the defenders of Hogwarts something far more powerful than a moment of silence could have ever offered: time. Time to regroup, time to process, time to rise. Within the stone walls of the battered castle, grief did not rot the spirit of the fighters. It sparked defiance. When Voldemort entered the courtyard and announced Harry's death, he expected wailing, begging, collapse. What he received instead was a collective tightening of the jaw, eyes filled not with despair, but determination. It was Neville Longbottom who shattered the silence, stepping forward to face Voldemort with unflinching resolve. He stood alone before the Dark Lord's army, trembling but unbowed. When Voldemort offered him a place among the Death Eaters, Neville refused without hesitation, and when he drew the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and beheaded Nagini in one fluid motion, he destroyed the final Horcrux anchoring Voldemort's soul. It was not only an act of bravery, it was a strike that made Voldemort mortal once more, and all of this happened because Voldemort had given his enemies the moment they needed to breathe, to think, to act. Had Voldemort chosen differently, had he remained in the forest, consolidated his position, and launched a swift final strike, he may have snuffed out the last embers of rebellion. The defenders, weary and wounded, were on the brink of collapse. But Voldemort's return to the castle allowed key players, Minerva McGonagall, Kingsley Shacklebolt, and Horace Slughorn, to rally reinforcements. And into the fray stepped reinforcements, the book notes, as these powerful witches and wizards bolstered the thinning line of defense inside the castle. The tide had not yet turned, but it had been given room to swell. Voldemort's theatrical choice also led to the most vital strategic mistake of all, bringing his key Death Eaters with him into the very heart of enemy territory. In his obsession with grandeur, Voldemort pulled his forces from the fringes of the battlefield and marched them into the Lion's Den. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, and several others entered the castle's inner court, confident in their looming victory. Yet in doing so, they lost the high ground they once held. They became targets. In the final wave of battle, some of the most loyal and dangerous of Voldemort's followers fell not on the front lines, but within the walls they had invaded. The consequences of Voldemort's miscalculation echoed through the final battle. Bellatrix, arguably his most fanatical lieutenant, was slain by Molly Weasley in a moment of raw maternal fury. The same Bellatrix who had murdered Sirius Black, tortured Hermione Granger, and destroyed countless lives was brought down not by a member of the Order, but by a mother defending her daughter. The symbolic weight of that death was enormous. The death of Harry Potter had not broken the resistance, it had crystallized it into righteous vengeance. "Not my daughter, you bitch!" cried Molly, and in that defiant roar was the death knell of Voldemort's vision. Even within his own ranks, Voldemort's grasp on loyalty began to decay. The Malfoy family, once proud and prominent, stood at the fringes of the crowd, no longer eager to claim allegiance. Narcissa had already betrayed the Dark Lord by lying about Harry's condition in the forest. Draco had failed to deliver Potter at Malfoy Manor, and Lucius was now a broken man, desperate only for the safety of his family. Voldemort's return to Hogwarts exposed not only his enemy's strength but the fractures within his own power structure. The psychological impact of Harry's apparent death did not silence the defenders. It reignited their courage. When Harry revealed himself alive within Voldemort's moment of glory, the illusion of control shattered completely. He emerged from Hagrid's arms like a ghost returned from the grave, and in doing so, he became more than a boy. He became a symbol, and symbols Voldemort never understood are more dangerous than spells. The book says, Harry was alive, and now everything was different. The very sight of him breathing, standing, daring to speak directly to Voldemort in the final duel broke the mystique of the Dark Lord's invincibility. In underestimating the power of narrative, Voldemort committed his greatest sin. He believed that fear was the ultimate weapon. But fear, like any tool, dulls with overuse. The people of Hogwarts had lived in terror for too long. When confronted with what seemed like the end, they realized they had nothing left to lose. This is why students, parents, and teachers alike stood up once more when Voldemort returned, not despite Harry's death, but because of it. They saw the cost and they chose to honor it with action. The battle that followed was not a clean fight. It was brutal, chaotic, and unpredictable. Spells ricocheted off broken stone, flames licked the hallways, and the very walls of the castle seemed to scream in protest. Yet through the chaos, one truth became clear. Voldemort had lost control. He may have carried Harry's body, but he had lost the narrative. The castle he sought to conquer with fear had turned into a fortress of defiance. Every step he took beyond the Forbidden Forest had pulled him further into a trap of his own making. Even in his final duel with Harry, Voldemort revealed the same fatal flaw. He could not see beyond himself. He believed that the Elder Wand, a weapon of myth and legend, would serve him unconditionally. He did not grasp that loyalty, not power, controlled the wand's allegiance. By disarming Draco Malfoy weeks earlier, Harry had unknowingly earned its loyalty. Voldemort never understood this nuance because he did not believe in loyalty. He believed only in domination. And domination, as the battle showed, is not sustainable without true allegiance. The castle roared in triumph as Voldemort fell, not because a man had died, but because tyranny had failed. Yet that failure had not been inevitable. It was forged in a moment of pride when Voldemort chose to return to Hogwarts, to show off rather than to finish the war. He could have vanished into shadow, regrouped, and crushed resistance elsewhere. Instead, he sought applause, and in seeking it, he gave his enemies the greatest weapon of all, a reason to hope. Perhaps that is the most ironic truth of the entire saga. In his quest to prove his superiority, Voldemort handed the final victory to those he most despised. His greatest flaw was not cruelty nor ambition, nor even obsession with immortality. It was his blindness to the power of love, of unity, of sacrifice. By dragging Harry's body back to Hogwarts, he unwittingly turned a symbol of death into a banner of defiance, and from that moment forward, he had already lost. Number 26, Barty Crouch Senior, blind obedience to the rules. Barty Crouch Senior stood as one of the most uncompromising figures in the entire Ministry of Magic, a man whose sharp suits and clipped mannerisms masked an inner storm of obsession. He was once admired for his integrity, his unshakable will, and his fierce stance against the dark forces that plagued the wizarding world during the First Wizarding War. But beneath that facade of discipline was a rigidity so severe that it ultimately cracked the very foundation he had sworn to defend. His belief in law and order was so absolute that it eclipsed reason, compassion, and even the basic nuances of justice. What began as strength turned to blindness, and in his most critical hour he could no longer see the danger born from his own decisions. During Voldemort's first rise, the wizarding world trembled under the weight of fear, betrayal, and death. In the eyes of the public, Crouch became a beacon of strength, the hammer poised to crush darkness at any cost. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he was granted authority and applauded for acting swiftly. However, speed turned to recklessness. He began authorizing the imprisonment of suspects without trials, a decision that defied the very principles the ministry was founded upon. As Sirius Black would later say from behind Azkaban's bars, "He's the one who sent me here, without a trial." Though Black was guilty of many things in the eyes of the world, his words echoed the grim reality. Justice had become vengeance. Among those sentenced was his own son, Barty Crouch Jr., a young man caught in the web of Death Eaters and their violent rebellion. Whether the boy was truly guilty or merely caught in the wrong company remains a question of moral complexity. But Crouch Senior had no time for complexities. To maintain his image and authority, he condemned his son with the same cold efficiency he applied to all others. There was no leniency, no pause for grief, no second look into the eyes of a pleading wife. "I have no son," he declared, not just to the courtroom, but to the world. His wife, frail and dying, begged him to save their child. He granted her a final act of mercy by allowing a polyjuice-fueled switch in Azkaban, but even that decision was drenched in secrecy and shame. This pivotal act, condemning his son in the name of order while hiding the truth behind a lie, exposed the core contradiction of Barty Crouch's philosophy. He demanded loyalty from others, but denied the humanity of his own family. His rigidity made him feared but not loved, respected but not trusted. Even Alastor Moody, a hardened Auror and longtime colleague, once noted that Crouch had lost the plot during the worst days of the war. That loss of the plot was not merely professional, it was personal. Crouch's crusade left him isolated, and in the absence of warmth, the chill of vengeance spread to his very bones. The irony of Crouch's crusade was that it birthed precisely the evil he sought to extinguish. Barty Crouch Jr., presumed dead by the world and hidden under enchantments, spent years living as a phantom in his father's home, cared for by Winky, their loyal house elf. But confinement and secrecy are poor tools of redemption. Crouch Jr.'s hatred fermented in the shadows. He did not grow remorseful or wiser, he grew vengeful. The son became a weapon sharpened by the father's coldness. When Voldemort returned, it was Barty Jr. who seized the moment, capturing Alastor Moody and impersonating him for an entire year within Hogwarts itself. As Moody, Crouch Jr. manipulated the Triwizard Tournament, maneuvering Harry Potter into a trap designed to resurrect the Dark Lord. The plot succeeded. Voldemort returned with a new body and new rage, and in a cruel twist it was Barty Senior himself who briefly uncovered the truth. He escaped the imperious curse placed upon him by his own son and fled to warn Dumbledore, only to be murdered before he could speak. A silencing charm, a grave in the Forbidden Forest, and a legacy buried under the weight of its own contradictions. Crouch's death was not merely a murder, it was the final punctuation on a story defined by imbalance. His life, governed by rules, ended in chaos. His belief in absolute control left him powerless. His trust in law was not accompanied by wisdom or flexibility, and so the law betrayed him. A man who once held the highest authority died unnoticed, unloved, and irrelevant, silenced by the very forces he tried to suppress. His downfall was not orchestrated by an enemy from without, but by the very monster he tried to erase from his life, his own son. This is where the tragedy of Crouch lies, in his refusal to see that control is not the same as justice. Justice must breathe, must bend with reason, and see the soul behind the crime. In condemning his son, Crouch did not rid the world of evil. He gave evil a motive, a story, and a vengeance. The boy who might have been saved became the man who sabotaged Hogwarts from within. The man who could have been a father became the architect of his own demise. In a broader sense, Crouch's failure serves as a lesson about leadership during times of fear. In the wizarding world, fear often blinds those in power. Crouch, like Fudge after him, chose denial over complexity, punishment over dialogue. But unlike Fudge, Crouch wrapped his choices in the illusion of moral superiority. He believed he was above bias, above weakness, yet his greatest weakness was his inability to acknowledge it. When asked about the Death Eater's trials, Dumbledore once said, "You place too much importance on the so-called purity of blood. You fail to recognize that it matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be." Crouch's failure to understand this very truth destroyed everything he touched. Even Dumbledore, a man of principle, saw Crouch as a cautionary tale. In The Goblet of Fire, he told Harry, "If you want to know what a man's like, take a good look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals." Crouch's treatment of Winky, the house elf, was another mirror of his philosophy. When she failed him, he discarded her in public humiliation. There was no understanding, no forgiveness, only rule-breaking and disgrace. His entire system of value was mechanical, not moral. In this way, Crouch's interactions, whether with Death Eaters, his own son, or his servant, revealed a man who understood law but not justice. The wizarding world moved on after Crouch, but his ghost lingered. His son was kissed by a Dementor before he could testify, erasing any hope of public redemption. The Ministry distanced itself from his memory, embarrassed by his methods. Fudge refused to acknowledge his warnings about Voldemort's return, choosing instead to bury the truth just as Barty's body had been buried in the woods. The cycle of blindness continued. But within the halls of Hogwarts, among those who paid attention, Crouch's story remained a warning, one carved not in stone, but in the shattered pieces of a once brilliant career. His legacy, though buried, haunted the conversation around how the Ministry handled threats. The secrecy, the silence, the manipulation of public perception. Crouch had taught them all these tricks. What he failed to teach, however, was the courage to admit fault, the strength to be merciful, and the wisdom to see people as more than their crimes. In trying to be incorruptible, he became inflexible. In trying to be strong, he became cruel. And in trying to be just, he became blind. The tragedy of Barty Crouch Senior is not simply that he was too harsh or that he misjudged his son. It is that he allowed his fear of chaos to override his capacity for love. He believed the ends justified the means, and in doing so he planted the seeds of his own destruction. The man who ruled through law died in lawlessness. The father who punished to protect became the catalyst of ruin. In the end, there was no applause, no monument, no whispered legacy of heroism. Only silence. And in that silence, the truth rang loud. Rules without compassion build prisons, not peace. Number 27, Percy Weasley betraying his family. Percy Ignatius. Weasley always walked a different path from the rest of his family. While his brothers laughed at rules and found mischief in every corner of Hogwarts, Percy embraced the system with rigid devotion. He polished his prefect badge with pride and spoke of ministry regulations with the same reverence others reserved for ancient spells. But this difference, once seen as a harmless quirk, would soon twist into something far more dangerous. In the years leading up to Voldemort's return, Percy's obsession with order, status, and ambition would become a wedge that fractured the Weasley family from within. As Cornelius Fudge tightened his grip on the wizarding world, paranoia replaced wisdom, and loyalty to the Ministry became the litmus test of morality. In this climate, Percy found his moment. He had always craved recognition, to be seen as more than just another Weasley. When offered the position of junior assistant to the minister, he accepted with pride, seeing it as a sign that his devotion had been rewarded. But there was a cost. "The Ministry's position is very clear on this matter," Percy said when pressed about Dumbledore's claims of Voldemort's return, echoing the party line with chilling detachment. In his new role, Percy abandoned not just his home, but his family's truth. While Arthur Weasley continued to work humbly at the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, and Molly fretted over her children's safety, Percy cut ties. He didn't just disagree with his parents, he rejected them. He moved out of the burrow and sent back letters that were cold, clipped, and impersonal. It was not merely a difference in opinion, it was a betrayal. "He's been promoted," said Ron bitterly, "and he's so full of himself now he doesn't want anything to do with us." The pain in those words wasn't just from sibling rivalry, it was the wound of familial abandonment at a time when unity was desperately needed. Percy's greatest crime was not ideological. He did not join the Death Eaters or practice dark magic. He didn't harm anyone directly. But his betrayal was insidious precisely because it wore the cloak of righteousness. He stood on the wrong side of truth, amplifying the lies of a corrupted ministry, and in doing so became a voice of denial when the world most needed courage. While Dumbledore was being vilified in the Daily Prophet and Harry Potter branded an attention-seeking liar, Percy helped shape the narrative that weakened resistance and emboldened fear. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, we see this chilling divide sharpen. The Ministry, through Dolores Umbridge, imposes strict oversight on Hogwarts, punishing dissent, rewriting curricula, and isolating students from the truth. Percy sends Ron a letter urging him to distance himself from Harry and align with Umbridge, calling her a very fine person. This moment is telling. Percy does not merely remain neutral, he actively encourages complicity with oppression. For those who grew up in loving, chaotic the Burrow, this was unthinkable. Percy was not just misguided, he was helping the enemy, even if unknowingly. What makes Percy's fall so tragic is the ordinariness of it. There was no grand seduction by evil, no cursed artifact, no dramatic choice at one point. He simply let his ambition, pride, and fear blind him. Like so many in the wizarding world, Percy found comfort in the illusion of safety. Believing in the Ministry meant believing that nothing had changed, that everything was under control. Accepting Dumbledore's words would have meant accepting a terrifying reality. Percy chose denial and in doing so abandoned not just his family but the truth itself. Yet the consequences of his choice extended beyond the family quarrels. By legitimizing the Ministry's denial, Percy indirectly contributed to the deaths that followed. When the Order of the Phoenix fought in secret to resist Voldemort's return, they did so without the support they might have had if people like Percy had dared to speak out. When Cedric Diggory died, the Ministry buried the truth. When Harry returned from the graveyard, only a few believed him. Percy could have helped change that. He had the ear of the minister, but he chose silence and allegiance to bureaucracy over the cries of his own blood. And still, the Weasleys waited. Molly Weasley, heartbroken, continued to set a place for Percy at dinner. Arthur, ever the quiet optimist, held out hope. Even Fred and George, though furious, longed for their brother's return. But Percy's silence persisted. As the war darkened and families shattered, his absence became louder than words. The boy who once lectured others on doing what was right had now become a symbol of what happens when morality bows to ambition. The turning point came late. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Percy returns. He does not arrive with fanfare or dramatic speeches. He simply walks in, ready to fight. The reunion is brief but powerful. "Hello, Minister," he says, as he duels alongside his father, making light of his former idol. It is an awkward attempt at humour, but in it lies years of regret. Percy had realized, too late, the price of his choices. He had missed birthdays, tears, laughter, and trust. He had failed the people who never stopped loving him. The tragedy deepens as Fred Weasley falls in battle. Percy, who just moments before rejoined the family, cradles his brother's lifeless body. Percy was shaking his brother and Ron was kneeling beside them. The image is harrowing. This is the cost of his absence, the weight of lost time. The boy, who once sought approval from strangers, now faced the irreversible truth. He had stood with the wrong side while his family faced death alone. No amount of courage in battle could erase the years of betrayal. But in that moment, Percy began to heal, not by speeches or apologies, but by standing where he should have always stood, with his family. Percy Weasley's arc is not one of villainy in the traditional sense, but it stands as a warning. The Harry Potter series often paints evil in clear lines: Voldemort's cruelty, Bellatrix's madness, Umbridge's sadism. But Percy represents a subtler kind of danger, the well-meaning bureaucrat whose faith in the system outweighs his loyalty to truth. His betrayal wasn't loud, but it was devastating. It showed how a man can lose his way not by malice, but by misplaced trust and pride. He became a symbol of how the rot within institutions can claim even the brightest minds. In many ways, Percy's return was an act of redemption. He fought bravely, stood by his family in their darkest hour, and grieved with them. But it came at a cost. Fred's death haunts not just the readers, but Percy's legacy. The war took many things, but for Percy it stripped away the illusions he had clung to. It forced him to see that loyalty to truth and family must come before loyalty to power. That realization, however noble, came soaked in blood. The wizarding world was filled with many heroes, some bold, some quiet. Percy was neither at first, but by the end he became something more meaningful, a man who stumbled, broke, and found his way back. His story is not one of glory, but of painful growth. It's easy to fight a dark lord when the path is clear. It's far harder to admit you've stood on the wrong side when the enemy wears a familiar face. His betrayal may not have involved dark magic or sinister plots, but it carved wounds that were just as deep. It reminds readers that betrayal does not always come from those we fear. It often comes from those we trust. Percy's name will never sit beside the likes of Voldemort or Grindelwald, but neither will it ever be fully cleansed of that moment when he chose ambition over love. As readers, we are often quick to forgive characters who die nobly or suffer visibly, but Percy's punishment was quieter. He lived. He lived to feel the coldness in his mother's voice, the hesitation in his brother's smiles, the silence at family dinners. He lived to see what he had missed: birthdays, weddings, the daily magic of being a Weasley. He lived with that weight, and in carrying it, he became a reminder of how easy it is to become lost and how hard it is to return. Percy. Weasley's tale is not about evil triumphing over good, but about pride blinding the heart. His redemption is real, but so is his fall. In the tapestry of the wizarding world, Percy is the thread that frayed and then stitched itself back, awkwardly, imperfectly, but with purpose. His mistake was painful, his return belated, but in the end he stood with the light. And in a world of shadows, sometimes that is enough.